very much indeed, Mike. It is a great pleasure to be back here again and to meet you all in this rather lovely corner of my home county. The title I've chosen for my talk today stems from one of these booklets, and it starts Generations Betrayed, Recovering National Rational Self-Confidence for Independence. And I'm going to start not with a quotation from Scripture, but from an ancient Roman, Marcus Tullius Cicero, an orator and defender of the constitution of the ancient Roman Republic. And he said, "To be ignorant of what happened before you were born is to remain a child forever." Well, Cicero knew this 2,000 years ago, and so do our political masters today. And by the measure of Marcus Tullius, the people of this country, particularly the young, are being kept deliberately in a childlike state of mind, rootless and easily manipulated, according to the politically correct dictates of our EU subordinate government. And I give a couple of examples here. The Royal Air Force Association recently conducted a survey which showed widespread ignorance about the Battle of Britain. SAFA, the Soldiers, Sailors and Air Force Association, conducted a similar survey about VE Day, which revealed that over half of the 18 to 25-year-olds did not know what VE Day celebrated. 38% could not identify Winston Churchill as the Prime Minister of the time. Rather more worryingly, 7% thought it was President Kennedy, 7% thought it was Margaret Thatcher, and 4% even thought it was Tony Blair. And they had little sense of chronological sequence. 38% believed that the first moon landing, Britain's entry into the European Union, and the fall of the Berlin Wall had all happened before VE Day. And a 2004 survey by the BBC showed that half of the 16 to 34-year-olds did not know that the Battle of Britain had happened during the Second World War. Now, more worrying still, a survey of results from 2006, 2007, and 2008, published in 2009, showed that undergraduates in the top 15% of academic achievement were also extremely ignorant. And here are the percentages of correct answers to the following questions. Who was the general in charge of the British Army at Waterloo? 16.5% could manage that one. Who was the reigning monarch when the Spanish Armada attacked Britain? That did somewhat better, 34.5% got that one right. 40.5% knew the profession of Isambard Kingdom Brunel. But when it came to a question, name one Prime Minister of the 19th century, only 11.5% could manage an answer. And when asked in what country was the Boer War of 1899 to 1902 fought, 30.6% could get the answer. Now, Professor Matthews of Cardiff University, who set these questions, also recounted how students in a typical tutorial had never heard of the Reformation and did not know what was meant by the term Protestant. He said, "This implies that all things being equal, 85% of my undergraduates' age group know even less than they do. In other words, we're looking at a whole generation that knows almost nothing about the history of their own or anyone else's country. And this is an outrage and should be intolerable." And details of how this appalling situation has been deliberately, officially fostered by the progressive educational establishment can be found in our CIB booklet on the National Curriculum for History, entitled Generations Betrayed, Cutting the Roots of Our National Identity. Researched and written for us by Chris McGovern, a very experienced headmaster, who also leads the Campaign for Real Education. Now, we commissioned this booklet and other studies with the help of volunteers because members of CIB serve in the Civitas programme of information about the EU, speaking to sixth forms in balanced debate with representatives of the European movement. And I've done this for about 8 years now, and until quite recently, I won every one, often by landslide majorities. Well, pride goeth before a fall. Around 2 years ago, I had the salutary experience of losing a debate with an MEP who advanced very little of substance, except to say to these young people, the European Union is like a family. Like your own family, it's not perfect, but you would be very lonely without it. He said a bit about the opportunities for study and careers in Europe, and that the EU was democratic because he was elected to serve in the European Parliament. He urged pupils to take an interest in politics and concluded his speech by saying, because one day, one of you could be President of Europe. He really did. It was like a child's bedtime story, and it was mortifying to lose to such tripe when I had made my usually successful reasoned case. Now, the next school I attended had an organised group of Pakistani boys who were determined that I was a racist. When I pointed out our unfavourable balance of trade with the EU, I said, so our biggest export to the EU has been skilled British jobs. And we have got back shelf stacking and spanner and screwdriver work in exchange. And to them, this was proof positive of my disrespect and hatred for immigrants. Now, at this school, a large proportion of the pupils abstained from voting. I don't know why. That was something I'd not experienced before. And the school was later the subject of a complaint because a lesson on the Holocaust of the Jewish people included a UKIP logo in association with the symbols of Nazism, fascism, and racism. And I'm in touch with 3 other speakers on the Civitas programme, who I know well, one in Shropshire, one in the West Midlands, and one in London. All experienced speakers, and they all report a similar experience. From always winning, they quite suddenly went to always losing. Now, I think that the general politically correct multi-culti indoctrination has played its part, but the EU itself has been very active in providing materials for schools, starting with infants where they provide nice colouring books and games and that sort of thing. And it moves up to course materials for older pupils, and there's even a comic book hero called Captain Euro, who's a little bit like Dan Dare, for those of you who remember the Eagle comic, but European, of course. Now, I don't think it's likely that we 4 experienced speakers in different parts of the country all just went off our form simultaneously. Something else had happened, and I believe that a long-standing programme of subtle indoctrination has now worked its way from infants to sixth form. And this is known to our enemies, and I believe that this is what is behind the demand for votes at the age of 16. All the youngsters I have addressed will, of course, be of voting age when the referendum comes. But there was one bright ray on the horizon, because a year later I returned to the scene of my first defeat and won the debate, but only by a modest majority, with a slightly amended presentation. It included a fair amount of emphasis on youth unemployment in the Eurozone and the terrible tragedy of Greece, where babies are actually dying because of the collapse of the Greek National Health Service, defunded by the order of the EU authorities. So the blob, as some people call the progressive educational establishment, can be defeated by adjusting our approach to something which is still genuine and factual, but with a stronger emotional content. So we have a population with rapidly changing attitudes, and indeed changing racial composition too. Yet many of us long-serving activists in the independence movement have not shifted our ideas to match. I'm not suggesting that we relax our determination to win our independence, but we should adjust our outlook to take account of people as they are and the institutions of the EU as they are today, after over 40 years of our self-inflicted subjection. Admirable fixity of purpose can become mere boneheaded stupidity in changed circumstances, just as some doubtlessly brave Colonel Blimps opposed the replacement of the British soldier's traditional red coat with khaki, or the replacement of cavalry with tanks. Different times call for different methods, strategy and tactics. But some people think they have the gift or the office, or just perhaps they're deluded, of immutable infallibility, rather like the laws of the Medes and the Persians, which altereth not. And one might ask, where are the Medes and Persians today? Now, this audience will certainly know the 6th chapter of the book of Daniel. Daniel fell foul of a directive issued by King Darius. The king found that this directive was unalterable according to his own rigid law, which we could call the acquis communautaire of its day. And even though Daniel was chief president of the commission, appointed by Darius over the Median-Persian Union, off he went to the lion's den. And the Medes and the Persians were not quite as advanced as the EU, and had not invented the rule which makes officials permanently immune from the law. If he'd been an EU commissioner, Daniel would have got off. Those of us who do not have inflexible infallibility have to look at situations as they arise. And although it can be very strenuous and painful indeed to change our minds about strategy and tactics while sticking to our objective, when the facts change, or when previously unknown or unconsidered facts come to light. When the independence movement was a scorned small minority, it was very sustaining to us to know that we were right and everybody else was wrong, and that they were furthermore acting illegally and unconstitutionally. We thought that with the arrival of the great day of liberation from the European project, there would be a glorious deliverance, our chains would fall away, and the world would watch in amazement as Britannia waived the rules. And all became sweetness and light. Noble lords and faithful commons would well and truly serve their sovereign, freed from political correctness and alien law. Our yeomen would till the soil, our ships plough the sea, whilst our factories would hum with renewed prosperity. And in face of the shoddy reality of the times, the utter scorn and contempt of the powerful, economic decline, many sparsely attended meetings in drafty, comfortless halls, and occasional infighting amongst us of astonishing viciousness, it was a noble enough myth and aspiration to sustain many of us through long decades of dispiriting, unrewarded toil. And like all good myths, there was a great deal of truth in it. But as the prospect of actually leaving the EU moved from pure imagination into the realm of political possibility, it became clear that the world was a far more complicated place than this myth allowed. This myth, which really did not look much beyond the great internal wrong of the EU project, the slighting of our abused constitution, as you were trying to rectify with your petition on Magna Carta. Now, we live by trade, and global trade depends on global regulation, global standards of goods and services, in which the EU has a small, declining part. But we are plugged into this global circuit through our membership of the EU, as we have been for 40 years of increasingly complex agreements. And simply to repudiate these treaties, which were freely entered into by our own elected governments and parliaments, would not only create enormous, quite unnecessary economic dislocation, uncertainty and chaos for ourselves, but would be a return to the ultimatum style of diplomacy favoured by Hitler and Mussolini, which so blighted the last century, not really very British way of doing things. And it would certainly rebound to the great loss of our industry and our country's reputation. We do not actually have the excuse of a Versailles Treaty imposed upon us, because the EU has taken nothing which has not been freely given by the parliaments which we elected under no discernible duress, but with a great deal of deceit by our political class. One analogy to the people who I call the Repeal the European Communities Act and Tell them to clear off brigade is with the sly manipulation of the terrible toddler in a tantrum, throwing all his toys out of the pram and expecting the crying grown-ups to soothe him and bring them back. They sell more to us than we do to them, so they'd have to, wouldn't they? They say, and that's the thinking. But I doubt whether the grown-ups would oblige. Now I can understand and indeed share the anger which fuels this attitude, but to take such a risk of disruption with the economy of a whole nation, trusting that all would simply be all right on the night, is not sober calculation, but a reckless cavalier folly. And what's more, there is absolutely no need for it either. Now, whilst enthusiasm will undoubtedly be called for in massive quantities, it has to be channeled to winning moderate, presently uncommitted opinion to the cause of independence. The object of fighting a referendum campaign is to win it, not to create an emotionally satisfying campaign experience leading to glorious defeat like the charge of the Light Brigade. As a French general remarked of that occasion, "C'est magnifique, mais ce n'est pas la guerre." What raises a cheer at a CIB or UKIP meeting will be much less inspiring to a couple with a heavy mortgage whose income comes from jobs supplying the EU market and depending on unbroken continuity of trade to keep up the payments on the family home. Now, whilst the reasons for leaving the EU are deeply constitutional and political and indeed religious, the arguments being advanced today are overwhelmingly economic. And that was just the way it was when they took us into it. And in the Sunday Telegraph of the 28th of July 2013, Mr. John Lidston wrote, "From 1961 to 1972, as part of a team of key businessmen, I spoke at meetings throughout Britain, arguing the case for the United Kingdom to join, for trade purposes, what was then known as the European Common Market. The case for enjoying favourable access to a marketplace of millions of people was overwhelming. Had Ted Heath, the chief negotiator, told the British people what the long-term consequences of joining the EU would be, I and my team would never have supported such a policy." And we now know from government documents released under the 30-year rule that they knew exactly what they were doing. Well, that common market with the EU and other countries does now exist in a separate institutional form, completely separated from the political structure of the EU. And it's called the EEA, the European Economic Area. Independent countries belong to it and to EFTA, the European Free Trade Association. Now, whenever you hear some prominent businessmen, there have been a lot of them recently, insisting that we must stay in the EU, it is the access to the EEA, the European Economic Area, that is what's commonly called the single market nowadays, to which he's referring, and not to the odious political superstate structure of the EU. The independent countries in the EEA are right outside those political structures, not subject to the rulings of the European Court of Justice, that politicised pseudo-court, which enforces the decisions of the European Commission. These countries are able to take their place on the world bodies which regulate global trade, and this is not much known, and increasingly tell the EU what to do. They can also make their own trade agreements and treaties with all the countries of the world on their own terms. Britain cannot do either of these things, but always has to go along with the common position decided for us by the EU. Goods and services from EEA countries enjoy access to the European single market on terms scarcely different from those which we have as a member state of the EU. Because when we leave the EU, it'll not be a matter of pulling up the gangplank and sailing away. The EU countries will still be our neighbours. We have no quarrel with them, and every reason and possibility of being on good neighbourly terms. I'm going to ask shortly for a video to be shown which explains the different possibilities for trade relations with the EU countries after independence, and how the EEA-EFTA option completely pulls the rug from under our opponents' scaremongering about loss and jobs of market, because our trade can go on exactly as it does at present. Behind this video stands much detailed work by Dr. Richard North of the EU Referendum blog and by Robert Olds, director of the Bruges Group, tabulated in great detail in a plan which they have called not Brexit, but Flexit, because it is flexible, adaptable, and capable of continuous updating. It's not perfect, but it takes account of the world as it is, and because it is a ready-made, off-the-peg solution, could be negotiated very quickly after a referendum decision to leave, without the need for a single day's uncertainty or disruption of trade, which could be so disastrous for that couple with the big mortgage, whom I mentioned earlier, and indeed for their employer. There will be no need to make a drama out of a crisis, because there need not be either. May I have the video?